Mr. Muema, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Steve, and thank you very much for having me.
Very well. Now, the Finance Bill 2020 is out, and curiously, I think it's out very early.
That is true because traditionally we normally have the Finance Bill in June. However, with our Constitution and the PFM Act, strictly speaking, this year where the Cabinet Secretary tabled the Finance Bill and budget estimates by the 30th of April, and that is by law. So ideally, they should have been presenting it by the 30th of April. That's a new constitution under the PFM Act that has been there. But traditionally, over time, even after we changed our constitution, we still continued presenting the finance bill in June. So this year, they have done it correctly within the legal framework.
Well, now let's get into the contents of the bill. What are the things that stand out for you in the Finance Bill 2020?
So for me, what stands out in the Finance Bill 2020, there is an introduction of what they're calling a minimum tax of 1%, which is payable on a quarterly basis by individuals, say, not subjected to tax under any other part of the Income Tax Act. So ideally, I'm looking at this. Remember, the Tax Amendment Act introduced turnover tax for people between 1 million shillings to 50 million shillings. Now this minimum tax seems to target people who are making losses because it is tied on installment taxes. So you're paid by the 20th of April, 20th of June, 20th of September, and 20th of December. That's the one interesting introduction, that introduction of the minimum tax of 1%. The other thing that I've seen coming through is a threshold for the residential income, which had been taxed at 10%. Interestingly, on COVID-19, we've now increased that percentage, such that landlords earning between 10 but not less than 15 million pay a higher rate of 15%. That's an interesting introduction in the Finance Bill 2020. And then pension paid to persons over the age of 65 will also be subject to tax. Now this worries me. We're not looking at our older generation. Malipo ya uzeni becomes a bit of a worrisome, and that is now being brought into tax. And another silent feature, obviously, is I think it's really welcome, is people who purchase and hire helicopters will be subject to VAT again if this bill passes. So that's some of the solid features that I pick up in the Finance Bill 2020. Steve?
You've spoken about an installment tax, probably for the lay person who's listening to you. What's an installment tax, and how does this tax apply, particularly in relation to companies that are making losses at this time?
Thank you, Steve. So installment taxes, it's paid on two bases. You look at your current year taxes or your previous year's taxes, and then you lift it by 10%. And then that number then is paid in 4 equal installments throughout the year. So by April the 20th, you pay installment taxes, June the 20th, you pay, September the 20th, and December the 20th. And then the following year, in April the 30th, you pay a balance of tax if there's a balance of tax that is payable. So the introduction of this minimum tax seems to allude that even if you're a loss-making company, you are expected to pay the 1% minimum tax, which is payable on a quarterly basis. So it's a roundabout way trying to pick up what Angola and Mozambique do, after we've seen the regime of minimum tax apply, and bring it here to targeting on companies making losses. Not a good move within COVID-19. But again, we have to fund the exchequer. So you can see it clearly, the CS is trying to find money to run government, even with the challenges of COVID-19.
Very well. One would expect that the government will be willing at this time to give more incentives particularly to businesses that are challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic. Are there any tax breaks or incentives that you've seen within the bill?
Yeah. So the bill, other than the increase of the threshold on residential income that we have seen from 10 to 15%, this specific bill aims to expand the tax base, because I've seen a lot of items which were initially exempt that are now being subject to tax. However, 2 weeks ago, we had the Tax Amendment Act come into play, and it had a couple of COVID-19 measures where employees earning 24,000 and below are not subject to tax. We had the turnover tax introduced, the limit up to 1 million to 50 million coming in, so those are COVID-19 measures. But this specific bill, it seems a lot of the matters that members of parliament throughout, when they're debating the Tax Amendment Act, have tried to be reintroduced in a cunning way in the Finance Bill 2020. So this specific bill, I'm just saying it's a lot of expanding the tax base that's coming, that's the intention. I mean, if you look at LPG as an item, the bill intends to bring in LPG and make it vatable. Okay? Now, if we are trying to conserve our trees, we are trying to conserve Mau forest, so we're trying to move away from firewood into using gas, i.e. LPG, then you come and introduce VAT on LPG, I think it is retrogressive, because then we'll end up again going back to cut our trees, because our people have to live, our people have to cook. So it's revenue expansion, but looking at the bigger picture, 360 degree, I worry, because making LPG expensive and trying to move from firewood, again, I think goes against what we're trying to do as a country, Steve.
What other items, I mean, I'm curious, you just mentioned cooking gas. What other items should the Mwananchi expect to see a tax on top of?
I mean, so a lot of items that were exempt on the agricultural side, for example, that were exempt, have now been moved into vatable. So the cost of food, of what Mwananchi consumes is bound to get higher, because I mean, some will be put into the exempt, and that was in the Tax Amendment Act. So the cost of living will definitely, from where I sit, increase. And then in this era, I mean, today we are doing this interview through online, and then we're introducing a digital service tax. Okay. I'd have expected some more measures, especially on airtime, so that because employers are providing airtime for employees working remotely, and even media, they're doing things remotely. I'd have expected measures to try and encourage that digital space. Now we've introduced a digital service tax, which is currently being proposed at 1.5% of the gross value of the transaction. Globally, a lot of jurisdictions have been mulling over the taxation of the digital transactions. It is a good way, but was it timely during COVID-19? I don't think so. We should have at least held our horses on something like the digital services tax. Steve?
Apart from the timing being not being quite timely, in your view, is it practicable? I mean, I'm looking at companies that are multinational, that operate across spaces, Facebook, Twitter. By talking about a digital service tax, are we, in a way, as a country, giving them a signal that probably this is not the right place to invest, this is not the right place to innovate?
Not quite. You see, the world over, we've all been struggling on how do we tax the digital services space, because the world is trying to grasp on it. So the way I see it working right now, from a practicability perspective, KRA will largely appoint banks or people who do mobile transfer to collect that tax on their behalf. Okay? So it will not be a disincentive to investors because it's being applied world over. People want to have a piece of that pie of the digital service. So we're only claiming a piece of that pie on the DST. How practical and implementation? Well, those challenges will be there, and we'll see the guidelines that the Revenue Authority will issue the next 90 days on how that will be practical. Steve.
I've also noticed in the bill that there is a proposal to remove the tax relief on home ownership savings schemes. Isn't this also retrogressive, given that the government is also trying to advance the agenda of affordable housing and enabling as many people as possible to get a roof over their heads?
Thank you, Steve. If you look at the Big Four agenda and affordable housing as an agenda for the government, on paper, the home ownership savings plan looks good on paper. But if you are to be honest and look at it, and I look at my experience having done tax for over 2 decades now, many taxpayers are not members of the home ownership savings plan. And largely maybe because the numbers are not too attractive. Yeah? And it's important also just to point out this proposal to remove tax on home ownership savings plan they tried to introduce it in the tax amendment bill, and Parliament threw it out. So I'd like to believe parliamentarians in their wisdom, the way they removed it in the tax amendment bill before it became an act, this is one that should be removed because on paper it looks good. We need actually just to maybe have a bit more incentives on the number, the quantum. 100,000 will not give you a good incentive. Move it to $500,000 because yes, we need a roof over our people's head. And if we are to meet on our Big Four agenda, this is one of the items that serves towards the Big Four agenda. So I'd like to believe Parliament will throw it out the same way they did about 2 weeks ago when they debated it.
I also noticed that there are also a number of things that the government wants to make tax exempt. For example, purchases for the purpose of the Kenya Defence Forces, Kenya Police. Isn't the taxman going to lose a lot of money in the process? What do you see as the motivation behind making some of those items tax exempt?
Well, some of the motivation on making some of these items tax exempt where they were zero rated before is to avoid a situation whereby the KRA or the government has to refund companies. We're in a situation whereby companies ended up being in a VAT refund position, and the end result of that then was government has to cut a check on VAT refund. So the shortcut way then for them is remove it from VAT refunds rated, make it exempt, and you don't have a refund per se. However, when you make it exempt, the supplier then has to pass on that cost to the consumer, effectively increasing the cost of living and the cost of that commodity.
All right, so that means more spending on the security side of things.
Absolutely.
Overall, will this bill pass muster in view of the challenges that the country is going through? Will it stand the political test? Because, I mean, people are looking for government to support them. This bill really speaks to that wish.
Well, Steve, look at it. Out of the proposed introduction of VAT on LPG, most of the changes which have already impacted various households were passed through the Tax Amendment Act. So in the current bill, the changes to the households will be minimal. On businesses, the bill proposes to reduce allowable expenses. Again, this attempt was there before in the tax amendment bill. Parliament did not pass it. So from where I sit, parliamentarians being rational individuals, given 2 weeks ago, they did not pass these changes. I do not foresee a situation whereby the National Assembly will pass these changes. That is my view.
All right. Thanks a lot, Philip. It's always a pleasure speaking to you on matters tax, and we'll definitely be speaking as the debate on the Finance Bill 2020 continues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Many thanks.
Well, over to you, Nina.